On the freezing afternoon of December 21, 1945, a telephone rang in the office of the Chief of Staff in Washington. D.C. General Dwight D. Eisenhower picked up the receiver and listened to the news that would mark the end of an era. General George S. Patton, the old blood and guts of the American Army, was dead. For 3 agonizing years, Eisenhower had lived a double life regarding Patton. To the press and the politicians in Washington, Eisenhower was the stern disciplinarian, the calm, rational supreme commander, constantly apologizing for his unruly subordinate. He was the man who had to reprimand Patton for slapping soldiers, censor him for insulting allies, and strip him of command when his mouth moved faster than his brain. Publicly, Eisenhower acted as if Patton was a birdina, dangerous liability that he barely tolerated for the sake of the war effort. But when that phone call ended, and the reality of Patton's death settled in, the mask finally slipped. For the first time since the guns of World War II fell silent, Eisenhower no longer had to play the politician. He no longer had to balance coalitions or soothe bruised egos. And in the weeks, months, and years that followed, a different truth began to emerge from the Supreme Commander. It was a truth he had buried under layers of diplomatic necessity and military protocol. In private letters, hushed conversations, and eventually his own memoirs, Eisenhower revealed what he really thought. He admitted that the public narrative was a lie. He admitted that while he was punishing Patton with one hand, he was secretly relying on him with the other to do things no other human being could do. He revealed that his harsh treatment of Patton wasn't because he despised the man, but because he feared losing the one weapon he knew he couldn't win the war without. This is the story of what Eisenhower didn't say while Patton was alive. It is the story of a secret admission that changes how we understand the victory in Europe. It is the realization that the most disciplined general in history knew, deep down, that sometimes you need a madman to save the world. To understand the weight of Eisenhower's final admission, we have to go back to a time before the stars on their shoulders, before the fame, and before the World War. We have to go back to 1919, at Camp Meade, Maryland. Here, the world met 2 captains who couldn't have been more different. George Patton was the American aristocrat, wealthy, flamboyant, an Olympic athlete, and a combat veteran who had already tasted blood in Mexico and France. He was loud, profane, and believed he was the reincarnation of ancient warriors who had fought at Troy and Rome. Dwight Eisenhower was a farm boy from Kansas, poor, pragmatic, and deeply insecure, because he had missed seeing combat in World War I yet. Amidst the grease and mud of the newly formed tank corps, they forged an unlikely brotherhood. While other officers were riding horses and studying cavalry tactics of the 19th century, Eisenhower and Patton were tearing down engines. They spent long nights debating the future of warfare. They wrote articles for the infantry journal, arguing that the next war would not be fought in trenches but by fast-moving steel monsters breaking through enemy lines. They shared a radical, dangerous vision. They were visionaries, but they were also outcasts. The Army establishment hated their ideas. The Chief of Infantry actually threatened to court-martial Eisenhower if he published any more ideas about tanks. Patton, with his family millions, could afford to tell the generals to go to hell. Eisenhower, who had a family to feed, had to learn the art of silence and diplomacy. It was here, in 1919, that their dynamic was set in stone. Patton would be the loud, aggressive spearhead. Eisenhower would be the careful, calculating manager. They were 2 halves of a whole. But 25 years later, that friendship would be tested to its absolute limit. By 1943, the world had turned upside down. The 2 captains were now generals, but the hierarchy had shifted. Eisenhower, the junior partner in their friendship, was now the supreme Allied commander. Patton, once the mentor, was the subordinate. The dynamic was toxic, but effective. Eisenhower had evolved into a master statesman, managing the colossal egos of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Montgomery. Patton had evolved into America's most feared combat commander. The first real test of this new relationship came not in Europe, but in the deserts of North Africa. In early 1943, the American Army suffered a humiliating defeat at the Kasserine Pass. Inexperienced, American troops were crushed by Rommel's Afrika Korps. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers were retreating without orders. The American military reputation was in tatters. Eisenhower knew he needed to fix the broken the Second Corps, and he knew diplomacy wouldn't work. He didn't send a nice guy, he sent Patton. When Patton arrived, the change was instantaneous and brutal. He ordered everyone, from cooks to colonels, to wear helmets and neckties at all times, even in the blistering heat. He fined officers for being unshaven. He turned a mob into an army in 10 days. And when he led them back into battle at El Ghadar, they won. This was the moment Eisenhower learned the fundamental truth that would guide him for the rest of the war. Patton was a headache, but he was a headache that cured cancer. Eisenhower realized that Patton could revive the fighting spirit of an army simply by walking into a room. It was a capability that Eisenhower, for all his organizational genius, simply did not possess. But Patton resented Eisenhower's transformation. In his diary, he wrote that Ike had become more politician than soldier, too concerned with British feelings, too cautious, too slow. Patton wanted to fight a war of annihilation. Eisenhower was fighting a war of coalition. The breaking point came in Sicily. It's August 1943, the infamous slapping incidents. Patton, exhausted and fueled by adrenaline, he struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, calling them cowards and threatening to execute them with his own pistol. When the news broke, the American public was outraged. Congress demanded Patton's scalp. General George Marshall in Washington left the decision to Eisenhower. Fire him or keep him. It's your call. This was the moment Eisenhower's public and private views began to diverge. Publicly, he was furious. He wrote Patton a scathing letter, ordered him to apologize to every single soldier in his army, and stripped him of his command of the 7th Army. He humiliated Patton on a global stage, forcing him to stand before his divisions and beg for forgiveness. But privately, Eisenhower made a calculation that he would only admit 2 decades later. He looked at the map of Europe. He looked at the impending invasion of France, and he realized a terrifying truth. I can't do this without him. Eisenhower knew that Montgomery was too slow. Bradley was solid but cautious. Only Patton had the fire to smash through the German lines. So, Eisenhower saved Patton. He took the political heat, he absorbed the criticism, and he kept his mad dog on a leash, waiting for the moment to let him go. However, saving Patton was not a one-time event. Just weeks before D-Day, in the spring of 1944, Patton almost destroyed his career again. At a private welcome club in Cootsford, England, Patton gave a speech where he stated that it was the destiny of the United States and Great Britain to rule the world. He notably left out the Soviet Union, America's crucial ally. The press got hold of it. The Soviets were furious. The Republicans in Washington used it to attack the administration. Eisenhower was beside himself. He had just saved Patton from the slapping incident, and now he actually drafted a letter relieving Patton of command. He was ready to send him home. But then, Eisenhower hesitated. He thought about the beaches of Normandy. He thought about the hedgerows. He thought about the inevitable stalemate that would occur. He threw the letter in the trash. He later told his aide, I am not going to fire him. George is a fighter, and I'm going to need a fighter. Eisenhower's decision to save Patton created a unique opportunity, one that played into Eisenhower's manipulative genius. The Germans respected Patton more than any other Allied commander. German intelligence reports called him the most dangerous man the Allies have. They assumed that wherever Patton was, the main invasion would follow. So Eisenhower weaponized Patton's reputation. He placed Patton in charge of the 1st United States Army Group A, Phantom Army made of rubber tanks, empty tents, and fake radio traffic stationed near Dover, across from Calais. For Patton, this was torture. While other men were preparing for the greatest invasion in history, he was posing for photos and giving speeches to empty fields. He felt like a show pony. He wrote to his wife that he felt he was destined to eternal damnation. He believed Eisenhower was punishing him, keeping him on the sidelines out of spite. But Eisenhower wasn't punishing him. He was using him. He admitted later that Patton's value in those months was greater than 10 combat divisions. By simply existing, by simply sitting in England. Patton pinned down the entire German 15th Army at Calais, keeping them away from the real landing beaches at Normandy. Eisenhower knew that Patton's ego could barely handle the deception, but he also knew that the Germans feared Patton's ego as much as his tanks. August 1st, 1944, the leash finally came off. Patton was given command of the Third Army in France. What followed was not just a military advance, it was a rampage. In a single month, Patton's forces tore across France, covering more ground and liberating more territory than any army in American history. He moved so fast that his own maps ran off the edge of the paper. He moved so fast that German command and control collapsed because Patton was already behind them before they knew the battle had started. This is where Eisenhower's post-war admissions become crucial. During the war, Eisenhower had to constantly restrain Patton. The most controversial moment came at the Falaise Pocket. Patton's forces had encircled the retreating German army. Patton wanted to close the gap, trapping the entire German force. But Eisenhower and Bradley ordered him to halt. Fearful of a collision with the British and Canadians coming from the north, Patton was screaming over the radio, begging to be let loose. The gap stayed open too long, and thousands of Germans escaped to fight another day. Eisenhower later admitted that Patton's instinct in that moment was likely correct. In private moments, Eisenhower reflected on those decisions. He admitted that Patton's instinct for the unforgiving minute, the moment when the enemy is broken and must be pursued relentlessly, was superior to anyone else's way. Eisenhower confessed that the broad front strategy, which kept all armies moving slowly together, was politically safe but militarily inefficient. He realized that if he had gambled everything on Patton in September 1944, the war might indeed have ended by Christmas. It was a haunting admission that his own caution, his own need to be a good ally to the British, might have prolonged the war. If there was ever a moment that vindicated Eisenhower's protection of Patton, it was December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the last desperate gamble of the Third Reich. Hitler threw 400,000 men and thousands of tanks against the thin American lines in the Ardennes. The front collapsed. Panic spread through the Allied command. At the emergency conference at Verdun on December 19th, the mood was grim. Generals were talking about withdrawal, about defensive lines, about catastrophe. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, how long will it take you to turn your army?" Patton's Third Army was currently attacking east. It helped the Bulge. He would have to disengage from battle, turn 90 degrees north, march 100 miles through a blizzard and attack the German flank. It was a logistical impossibility, a maneuver that should take weeks. Patton didn't blink. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Other generals laughed nervously. They thought he was bragging. They thought he was insane. But Eisenhower didn't laugh. He looked at his old friend, the man he had saved from disgrace in Sicily, the man he had saved from the Kootsford scandal, the man he had used as a decoy in England, and he said simply, "Go." This was the moment Eisenhower admitted to himself that Patton was irreplaceable. No other general in the world could have executed that order. Patton did exactly what he promised. He moved an entire army through hell and ice. He even issued a famous prayer to God, asking for good weather to kill Germans. A move that baffled the religious Eisenhower, but seemingly worked when the skies cleared the next day. Patton slammed into the German flank and relieved the besieged troops at Bastogne. It was the greatest feat of arms in American military history. And it happened because Eisenhower knew, despite all the headaches and the drama, that Patton was a miracle worker. But even in victory, Patton was a liability. In March 1945, Patton launched the controversial Hammelburg raid. He sent a small task force, Task Force Balm, behind enemy lines to liberate a POW camp. It wasn't a strategic objective. It was personal. Patton believed his son-in-law was being held there. The mission was a disaster. Task Force was destroyed. 32 men were killed, and most of the rest were captured. Eisenhower was furious. He knew Patton had wasted lives for a personal favor. Any other general would have been fired on the spot, but Eisenhower let it slide. Why? Because by that point, Patton's Third Army was crossing the Rhine and tearing into the heart of Germany. Eisenhower had made the calculation that the moral cost of Patton's selfishness was outweighed by the strategic value of his brilliance. It was a cold, hard equation that haunted Eisenhower, but one he stood by. But wars end. And warriors are rarely good at peace. In 1945, with Nazi Germany defeated, Patton was made the military governor of Bavaria. It was a disaster. Patton was a man of absolute skill or be killed. He didn't understand nuances, hated the denazification process, arguing that the U.S. needed to rebuild the German army to fight the Soviets. He openly stated that the Allies had defeated the wrong enemy and that they should have kept marching east to Moscow. Eisenhower's patience finally broke. There was no enemy left to fight. The indispensable man was now just a liability. In October 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of his beloved Third Army command. It broke Patton's heart. He felt betrayed by his oldest friend. He felt that Eisenhower had sold his soul to politics. 2 months later, Patton was paralyzed in a freak car accident. It was a bitter irony. The man who had survived machine gun fire and tank battles was broken in a low-speed collision with a truck at 20 miles per hour. 12 days after that, he died of a pulmonary embolism. Died not in battle, but in a hospital bed, feeling forgotten and discarded. It was only after the funeral that the walls around Eisenhower came down. In his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, and in private letters discovered years later, Eisenhower finally articulated the truth about his relationship with Patton. He used a specific word to describe Patton: indispensable. For a supreme commander to call a subordinate indispensable is extraordinary. It means irreplaceable. It means without him, we might have lost. Eisenhower admitted that Patton was a problem child, yes. But he also admitted that Patton possessed a genius for war that was unique in the Allied command. He confessed that managing Patton was the most exhausting part of his job, but also the most rewarding. He realized that Patton's intuition on the battlefield was almost supernatural. Most tellingly, Eisenhower reflected on the nature of command itself. He admitted that the very qualities that made Patton a nightmare in peacetime, his arrogance, his aggression, his refusal to compromise, his distrust of the Soviets, were the exact qualities that made him a savior in wartime. Eisenhower realized that you cannot have a man who is a calm diplomat on Monday and a ruthless killer on Tuesday. You have to accept the whole package. Eisenhower also admitted, in later years during the Cold War, that Patton's suspicion of the Soviet Union had been prescient. Patton had warned that the Russians would be the next enemy, a view Eisenhower dismissed in 1945 but spent his entire presidency fighting in the 1950s. The madman, turned out, had seen the future more clearly than the statesman. Eisenhower's final admission was a confession of the burden of leadership. He admitted that he had to be the bad guy to Patton's hero. He had to be the one to say stop, so that Patton could be the one to say go. He realized that his own legacy as a great supreme commander was built, in large part, on the victories delivered by the man he constantly had to discipline. The relationship between Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton was one of the great tragedies and triumphs of World War II. They were friends who became rivals. They were partners who became estranged. One became president. The other became a legend. But in the end, Eisenhower told the truth. He admitted that the carefully curated image of the war, the neat lines on the map, the polite conferences, was only half the story. The other half was the chaos, the speed, and the violence that George Patton brought to the battlefield. Eisenhower admitted that he kept Patton not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Because when the world is burning, you don't need a diplomat. You don't need a nice guy. You need a man who can march through a blizzard in 48 hours and kill the enemy. Eisenhower knew that. And he took that truth and his gratitude to his grave. What do you think? Was Eisenhower right to hold Patton back for political reasons, or should he have unleashed him sooner to end the war? And do you think the war would have ended by Christmas 1944 if Patton had been in charge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of World War II, please hit the like button. It helps us tell these stories. And for more documentaries on the greatest rivalries in history, make sure to subscribe to World War Stories and ring the bell.